Welcome to Testing 1 2 3, a podcast brought to you by TestGenius.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Testing 1 2 3. It's a podcast produced by TestGenius and Biddle Consulting Group. And I'm Jenny Arnez. I'm your host, and I'm joined today with Mike Callen. He's our co-host, but also the president of TestGenius. Mike, you want to say hi?
Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, or good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you're
wherever you are on this round globe.
That's right. And we're sure glad you joined us today. So for today's episode, we're going to do things a little bit differently. We don't have an additional guest joining us today. What we're going to do is look at a specific question that a client recently asked Mike. It is all about some best practices that they could incorporate in their hiring practices. And it led to an interesting conversation about validity and adverse impact. And so today what I'm going to do is present Mike with a scenario very similar to what our client offered to him earlier, and just have a conversation around that. Does that sound good, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so let me present the scenario. Let's just say Acme County has reached out and they want to hire, or they are hiring for dispatcher 1 positions. Now here's some background. Each department in the county determines their own requirements for the dispatcher 1 position. All departments are using a pre-employment skills test. And after a phone interview, selected candidates take the pre-employment test. It's only the highest scoring candidates that are selected for an in-person interview. Acme County has reached out to us, and they're concerned that their hiring practices, including the pre-employment skills test, are resulting in adverse impact towards protected groups. Mike, how would you help a client like this?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. If we step down through each of those bars on this image right here, we can talk a little bit about each one. So you have a county that has different departments, all of whom have a job title called Dispatcher 1. And then they're determining their own requirements for each of these positions. Presumably they're slightly different from location to location. And so one of the things that you always want to be concerned with if you're an employer is the optics in terms of how do things look and feel to the applicant. And in the case of a county or a private organization, often the applicants are constituents or customers. And so you want to be a good citizen in your environment, and you want to be doing things that feel good and fair and righteous in terms of their eyes, so that you don't sully your own reputation. And if the dispatcher 1 position is different in each of those organizations, it might be better to title them slightly differently. For instance, it could be dispatcher 1 fire, dispatcher 1 police, dispatcher 1 EMS, or however they're dividing things up. And that way you get a little bit of disparity from one title to the next. And I think the reason that I mention that is that you have job applicants who are going to talk to one another. And if you apply for a position over here and you're tested, or you're minimally tested, and you apply for another one over here and you're maximally tested, they really wear you out. That's going to feel weird if they're all titled the same thing. The same job title within different departments could vary, and it could be justifiable to have different recruitment processes. It probably is justifiable to have different recruitment processes for each position. But again, in terms of optics, it might be something to differentiate between the dispatcher 1 position at each of those locations. So that's definitely one thing to look out for. Another thing to look out for, and this comes up very often in these kinds of conversations, is within the recruitment. Let's say your recruitment process is different in each of those 3 or 4 departments. but your recruitment process within that one particular recruitment at one department, it's got to be the same. You can't do different things for different applicants within the same recruitment. So you want to be really consistent in that regard.
So this might be a bit of a tangent, but you mentioned about departments having perhaps changing the job title where they don't all say dispatcher one. I'm wondering how job analysis might relate to that. We've had previous clients or previous guests who've talked about job analysis. I'm just wondering if you might be able to touch on that just briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. So a selection plan, which is any part of the recruitment process from beginning to, which should be the job posting all the way through onboarding somebody, should be based upon a job analysis. This is best HR practices. And a job analysis is a really deep dive into what are the tasks and duties that are performed on the job, what would be the minimum qualifications, what would be the desirable qualifications, what would be the work schedule, the work environment, what personal characteristics are required in order to perform the job. So it's really all of the technical aspects that have to do with any particular position would be fleshed out in a job analysis. And job analyses are really time-consuming, challenging tasks to perform. And while everybody's supposed to have current job analyses, they very often don't. And it becomes one of those eating the elephant situations. How do I do job analyses when I have 500 different positions within my county or my organization or company or whatever? And so the answer for that is, you basically just do it one bite at a time. It's best, in my recommendation, it's best to start with the positions that are most often recruited for, or the positions that are most often hired and then reallocated within the organization. So you have these entry-level positions that people come into, and then rather than posting a job externally, they post it internally, and then they move people around within their organization. So those would be the ones to start with, and then you keep going, doing the next most high volume positions and until you get all the way through the process. And then it's painting the Golden Gate Bridge. Once you get done, they're really old in 3 years or when the position fundamentally changes. And so you really need to go back and do them again. But you can use the existing job analyses for the redo, which can make the process a lot easier. So job analysis is super important in this particular practice. And some things that come from the job analysis are the job description. And the job description would be a formal paragraph or several paragraphs that talk about what this person does in this position. And then from the job description would be distilled typically a job posting, which would be the text that's put into an ad or a posting online that talks about the job title that's going to be opening up, some basic requirements, minimal requirements, some desirable qualifications, and then that little summary of the job description. So they're a very important part of the selection process.
Okay, great. And actually, I think what I'll do is in our show notes, I'll post a link to IO Predict. They're one of our partners who actually does job analysis. And Dr. Clinton Kelly's been on our show before and talked about that because I think definitely that would be very helpful.
Yes.
It definitely relates to this scenario here. As we consider this process that Acme County has for hiring dispatcher one, where are the tests in this process? What are the tests?
Yeah, it's a really important point that you're making here, Jenny. When we're approached by clients or prospects and they talk about testing and validation and adverse impact, the focus is always on the literal test. And the fact of the matter is that there's many other steps of the recruitment that are also tests. I was just talking to Dan Biddle, our CEO, a few minutes ago, and he was telling me a story about he did some consulting for the Department of Justice. And he was at a conference where there were about 500 HR practitioners, and the head of the DOJ asked all of the attendees to raise their hands if they agreed that an interview was a test. And it was half or less that raised their hand.
Hmm.
And the fact of the matter is, an interview is a test. There are a variety of things called PPTs. Those are practices, procedures, and tests that occur throughout the recruitment process in which decision making factors are considered in this employment selection process. An interview absolutely positively is one. People sit down, they talk to another human being or a team of people, and they're rated on their responses, and some people are moved forward and some people aren't moved forward, and that is part of the selection process, and therefore an interview is a test. But there's other things that are PPTs that also act like tests. For instance, we talked earlier when you brought up the job analysis. One of the derivatives of the job analysis is the job posting. And the job posting talks about, hey, here's what you perform on the job. And if the job posting and its minimum requirements are not valid, that is, they're not matched exactly to that particular position, then anyone who's reading the job posting may actually deselect themselves from the process based upon the information that they've been provided. And if the information that's provided is incorrect, then you could have just created adverse impact in the very first step of your recruitment process by not making an accurate job posting and especially accurate minimum qualifications. So that's a test too. And every little intermediate step along the way that either allows certain people to continue or doesn't allow people to continue or rank orders people or weights their scores, any of those aspects of the recruitment process that make those kinds of decisions are also tests and should be scrutinized in the same way that people and we scrutinize our own tests.
Okay, so if I'm understanding you correctly, what you're saying is, like in our scenario here, Acme County, they're concerned about there being adverse impact. And certainly they need to look at making sure that they validated the actual pre-employment test, but they actually need to look at their whole process from job description, job posting, interviewing process, that phone interview that happens that determines who moves on to the next step.
That's absolutely correct what you're saying there. And to that end, people will ask us for data in terms of pass rates for certain protected groups, EEO protected groups. And we don't have that data because we're not getting that EEO data from the applicants. The employers who are going through the recruitment, they're getting that information. They're collecting that information up front, and they have a piece of software typically known as an applicant tracking system, an ATS. And the ATS will actually do analysis at each of these steps to let them know where they may potentially have problems so they can dig into it and they can see whether or not there's some adjustments that need to be made. Now, every time there's adverse impact against a protected group, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do something different. There are instances where adverse impact occurs, and that adverse impact is simply a part of the process, the part of living in a real world. And we can talk a little bit later about that as well. But you always want to stop and you want to look and you want to, is there adverse impact? Why is that adverse impact occurring? What could we do differently to avoid that adverse impact? Those kinds of things are questions that you ask. And let me throw out an example because it's a big thing to wrap your head around. There's a lot of things we're talking about right here. But the classic example is in a job that requires physical ability. Let's say, for instance, there's a person who has to load concrete bags onto a pallet so that it can get shrink wrapped and loaded into a truck and shipped away. So there's a conveyor belt that brings out these these bags. And so what you might do in terms of a physical ability test to hire somebody into that position is you might have a conveyor belt, and you might have this person grabbing the bags. You tell them how you want them stacked, and you see how many bags they can stack in 5 minutes, or can they stack the number of bags that come out in a 5-minute period at the same rate they would come out on the conveyor belt on the job itself. Now, let's say, for instance, that this particular test is using 60-pound bags. And so HR calls over to the plant and says, hey, we're getting ready to do this physical ability test. I want to make sure that we're still using 60-pound bags in the plant. And the supervisor says, oh, no, I'm so glad you called. Remember when the risk analysis people said we're going to have far fewer incidents of injury if we use 40-pound bags instead. So we switched over to 40-pound bags. So we just dodged a bullet because we would have been testing at a level that is much higher than is required on the job. And that a physical ability test is going to almost always result in adverse impact against women. Generally speaking, men are stronger than women, and so there will be a disparity in between the passing rates for men and the passing rates for women for a physical job, especially one that's really demanding. And so there's baked in adverse impact that comes with that kind of position. But by measuring using the wrong size bag of concrete, you're actually creating additional adverse impact that otherwise would not have occurred. And that is an instance that is impossible to defend. You cannot defend that. You can defend the adverse impact that occurs between natural differences in physical strength between men and women, but you cannot defend against the adverse impact that occurs because you ask them to do more than the job requires.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So what you're saying then is that there are times, provided that your test is valid, that what your test is requiring of the candidate is actually a reflection of what they'll be required to do on the job. When that is in sync, there are times where an adverse impact will occur.
Yeah, absolutely. There are going to be times in which it occurs. It doesn't mean that you don't look for it. You still look for it because you want to evaluate the process. If you can measure the same thing in a different way and it doesn't have adverse impact, then it's a better way to measure it. And you go that direction. In our tests, we use something called work sample tests. So we're actually like the concrete bags, we're actually simulating the job. It's very hard to find a testing process that's more valid or equally valid to actually simulating the job than simulating the job. And as an employer, if I'm hiring people to load pallets, to shrink wrap that material and get it onto a truck because I'm selling concrete, I have the ability to make sure that the pallet loader can load pallets, right? That's just a fundamental thing. So whether or not there's adverse impact, it isn't important. What matters is that the selection process, the test in this case, is it valid and consistent with business necessity? If it is, then you are justified in having some adverse impact that enters into the process.
So you said business necessity. That sounds like that might be an actual term. Is there a set of key laws or guidelines that govern pre-employment testing?
And guidelines is the key word. There's a huge document which can be found at uniformguidelines.com, which is the Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures. And it's a document that was put together, I believe, in the 70s. It's been revised a couple times and now has a whole host of questions and answers that comes with it as well. But it was put together by a really large committee of practitioners who operate in this space. And it covers things like job analysis, job descriptions, test validation, also sorts of different kinds. And it really sets forth the practices and principles that are the best practices for doing these things. Now, I don't know that it was ever codified into law, but the courts have relied on it again and again, and the DOJ, Department of Justice, the OFCCP, all these different governing bodies, including other state bodies, have relied upon it as the standards for doing things correctly. And so it comes up very often in legal trials and adjudications, like by labor boards and those kinds of things. That comes up very, very often. So it's a very important document. Another thing that's really important is the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we won't really get into that here because it gets into a whole another area of essential functions and those kinds of things. But yeah, in terms of dealing with this issue, the Uniform Guidelines is really probably the main body of literature that by which everything should be measured in terms of doing things correctly. And that's what we do as well. In fact, in our software, in the TestGenius software and Critical OPAC, we use a validation wizard, which is based upon Section 14C and 15C of the Uniform Guidelines. Section 14C is the section that deals with content validation. It's the steps that you need to go through in order to properly content validate a test. And that's how you determine whether or not it's valid and consistent with business necessity. As well, 15C is the reporting section for the same. So it talks about what are the things that need to be outputted in a report that will properly document that this validation has taken place. And so in our validation wizard, we're running people through a process. In this case, we would run subject matter experts who are performing well on the job for a year or longer, or supervisors of those people or trainers of those people who are abundantly familiar with the position. We're going to run them through each of the tests that an employer would purport to measure. And then at the end of each test will be a survey that will ask them questions about the job relatedness of that test. And at the very end of each test, it would say, Jenny Arnez, your score on this test was 96, but given your position and your knowledge of this job, what in your opinion would be a minimum qualifying score for somebody who's entering into this position the first time? So you would say, hey, I've been doing this for 20 years and I'm an uber expert, so 96, it's really good for me. But because I directly just felt the difficulty of that test and I'm knowledgeable about how well skilled and able someone should be coming into this position, I would say that if somebody scored 83 or better on this test, then I would consider them to move on from the applicant to the candidate role. And so the wizard will take in all of the subject matter experts' opinions, including yours, and the suggestions for the cutoff scores, and it will create a validation report that says, of this test battery, let's say it had 6 tests in there. For this test battery, you should only use these 5 tests because one of them was determined to be not valid for this position. Maybe it was more difficult than the position, like the 60-pound bag of concrete instead of the 40-pound bag of concrete. And so for that reason, it gets thrown out. As well, here's 4 different defensible job-related cutoff scores that you could use. Your average of your suggested cutoff scores, and then that minus 1, 2, and 3 standard error of measurement, which is a statistical step downward that one might use to create different significant layers below the high cutoff. If we don't want to use, let's say 86 was the first one, minus 1 SEM might bring you down to 81. So let's say we didn't have enough people to interview. We want to step down to the next appropriate layer. We might use the cutoff minus 1 SEM, which would be 81. And that gives us 5 people to interview, or maybe minus 2 SEM, and it brings us down to 76. And that might be 10 people to move on to the next step, that sort of thing.
Okay, so what you're describing is the validation process, and in particular, the validation process if someone were to use TestGenius as their pre-employment test.
Yeah, or if they did it all on their own. You can do this process manually, and this process is outlined in the Uniform Guidelines. It's just that what we've done is we've said, we value this process so much that we want to make it as easy as possible for you, our clients. And so we're creating a wizard that literally just walks them through, and then it formats the report and then creates the report and sends it off to people.
Okay, so let's real briefly, just a high level outline of the validation process is using the test selection wizard, Right.
We didn't talk about that, but yeah, you want to start off with the test selection wizard. Let's show the content validation slide because that's helpful in understanding the test selection wizard process, if that's okay.
Yep.
Content validity is like building a bridge across a river. On one side, you have the test. So go ahead and go to the next slide. And then on the other side, go ahead and do the next one, you have the job. And it's represented by these duties that are performed. And the bridge is supported in the middle by this pier, and that is the KSAs. KSA stands for knowledge, skills, and abilities. So if you look at this process, the test requires certain knowledge, skills, and abilities. The job duties require certain knowledge, skills, and abilities. And so what we're doing is we're connecting the test on one side of the river to the job on the other side of the river, and the linkage is the knowledge, skills, and abilities. If we look at the test selection wizard, I don't think we have an image for it, but basically what we're doing on the test selection wizard is we're listing duties that might be performed on the job. And so a person is going to go through and they're going to check off duties that are performed by the position that's being recruited. And as they go through and they check off those duties, have linkages to KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities, which are linked to specific tests within our system. And so you check off 10 duties, and that might create a list of 8 or 9 tests that we may suggest that they use for selection purposes for this particular position. And so that's the test selection wizard. The next step that one would go to in order to determine whether or not the test battery, in this case, a battery of individual tests, is valid and consistent with business necessity, is to go through the next part, which is the validation wizard. And in that case, we recommend 7 to 10 subject matter experts. And again, those would be the incumbents that I described earlier, people who have been successfully performing on the job 1 year or longer, or supervisors of that position, or trainers for that position, but people that are abundantly familiar with that job. And you want to go through and you want to cherry pick really high performers, but you also want to get a demographic mix that matches that of your existing workforce and particularly of your recruitment area. But the idea here is that these people are going to go through those tests. They're going to take those tests with that wizard turned on, and the wizard's going to ask them survey questions, cutoff score suggestions, and it's going to result in a validation report that might be 30 or more pages long. That's going to have a table at the end that says, here's the tests you validated, and each of these marked yes are ones that you should use on your particular recruitment or could use in your recruitment. As well, here's the defensible job-related cutoff scores. So that's those two wizards, how they work, step 1, step 2, and then step 3 is your recruitment itself. So you take the validated test and you actually employ it for use for selection with your job applicants.
Okay, so let's say you have your valid test, you have candidates taking it. So do you just assume that the person who scores the highest on the test, that's your number one applicant? What's your recommendation there, how to use the scores?
That's a really great question. We didn't talk about this, but one of the survey questions that's asked at the end of each test when you're running your subject matter experts or your incumbent employees through there is whether or not the test is performance differentiating. I'm going to give you an example. Let's say that you're hiring somebody who has to type. Dispatcher is a good one. They're doing short bursts of texts, but they need to be able to type relatively quickly, and they need to be able to type accurately. So typing with speed and accuracy is an important attribute for that job. The fastest speed that they may need to type might be 35 words a minute, right? So the question becomes, does that mean that somebody who types 70 words per minute is twice as good as somebody who types 35 words per minute? And in this case, the answer is no. You really only need to do what you need to do, and going faster than you need to go isn't necessarily a benefit. And so that would be a good example of a test, the results of which are not performance differentiating. And so what we would do is we would look at everybody from 35 words per minute and above as being equally suitable for the job. So there wouldn't be any rank ordering at all. And that is really just one of the main reasons why setting the cutoffs is so important. If you have a defensible job-related cutoff score, then what it does is, let's say you just chose the person who could type 70 words per minute and you hired them. You've ignored all these other attributes of a human being that may or may not make them a good employee. Sure, they can type, but that is not the entirety of any job. And so by choosing too high, you may have ignored applicants who were equally qualified in terms of keyboarding, but had so many other things that they could apply to this work area. And so that's a really important aspect to keep in mind. Now, there are some that people will go through and say, yes, this is performance differentiating, because people who do score higher on whatever knowledge, skill, or ability it is, they may be the best, and everybody who's less than them is less good. But again, that's just one of the many reasons why you make a selection decision. And so again, cutoff scores are really important.
And the validation process helps you to set those cutoff scores.
It helps you to set those cutoff scores, and it also will report back to you whether or not something is performance differentiating, which lets you know that once you get to that cutoff score, everybody from there and above should be considered equally skilled or able for that particular performance dimension.
And we'll be right back after a word from our sponsor.
Ready to revolutionize your HR strategies? Head over to TestGenius.com to discover our latest tools and solutions designed to streamline your hiring processes.
So I'm going to flip back real quickly at our scenario back on here, just so we can summarize what we've touched on. Acme County, they're concerned about adverse impact. So the first step really is they need to remember that the testing process or testing happens throughout the whole selection process, throughout their whole selection plan. And so they have to pull back the lens, not just focus on the pre-employment skills test, but also to look at their job posting, their interview practices, and so on.
All the other tests as well.
All the other tests. And then focusing in on what our specialty is here at with TestGenius is the pre-employment skills test. And then they need to validate that using their subject matter experts, using the tools that they have within TestGenius, assuming that they're a TestGenius client, using the test selection wizard, the validation wizard, which then helps them set accurate, is that the term? Accurate cutoff scores?
Defensible and job related is the important aspect of it. And let me interrupt 1 second. This is our recommended best practice. Not every client goes through the validation process for every administration of TestGenius. We know that. It's our strong recommendation that they do it because of two things. We think about the recruitment process. Think of about as a coin with two sides. Okay, on one side you have defensibility. So in the instance where somebody questions the hiring practice, is that hiring practice defensible? Or if you go to your applicant tracking system and you find that your physical ability test had adverse impact, is that defensible in that particular case? So being able to answer some sort of challenge to the recruitment process is really important. But when you flip that coin over and you look at the other side from the utility side, the defensibility side, utility. And utility talks about how does this test select people who are going to go on to be really good employees on the job. And the beautiful thing about this, and this is the beauty that comes with the brilliance of the uniform guidelines, is because people who were really experienced in the practices that can both have and result in a safe recruitment and hire people who do really well on the job are contributing to this framework that we follow here. And so that's why it's really important to go through and do the required work, or to do the recommended work in order to be able to end up with a testing process that's valid and consistent with business necessity and cutoff scores that are defensible and job related. So that's as far as we can say about that. If somebody decides that they're not going to go through the validation, that's their choice, but they've taken on that burden themselves in case the hiring practice is challenged, for instance. If it's challenged, then they don't have a leg to stand on in terms of the defensibility if they go retroactively and do the validation process and the validation report shows that the test isn't valid and consistent with business necessity, or that they use cutoff scores that were too high. So people are taking that risk upon themselves by skipping that part of the process.
Mm-hmm. And how often does the validation process need to happen? Do we do this every year? What is that? How do you determine that?
So the validation process is good to do, generally speaking, at about a 3-year clip. And that would be the same pace that you would want to try to review your job analyses. Now, the difference, or sorry, the caveat for both of those scenarios would be unless the job fundamentally changes. There's been just a ton of technology that's come into the dispatch world, for instance, which is to follow our scenario here. People can text videos and images. Let's say somebody gives you a license plate number and you type that into the computer-aided dispatch system, and they also send you a photograph of a scene, and the photograph has the license plate on there, and you can clearly see that the person reported the wrong license plate number. So you have to be able to discern the difference between the two. You have to be able to decide which of those has the right data, and then you have to be able to update it into the system. Because if you're talking about putting out a bolo looking for somebody with this license plate and you use the wrong license plate number, that's really critical. So that would be a good example of a fundamental change that happened at a dispatch center that might require you to go back and look at the versions of these tests that you're using. Maybe before you were using text-only versions, now you want to use versions that have photographs and images and questions about those images in there.
I think we've done a good job, or you've done a great job on helping Acme County here take a look at their hiring practices and some action steps that they can take. And anything else that you want to add to today's conversation?
We talked about content validity, and content validity is when you're building that bridge from the test to the KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities, over to the job on the other side. And there's another kind of validation which we don't do with our wizard, but can be done and is very much valuable, and that's called Criterion validity. And Criterion validity is when you have some sort of aspect of job performance on the axis over on the left-hand side, and then you plot that against test scores along the bottom axis there. So each of these data points would be some sort of measured metric of job performance. Maybe it's supervisor ratings, or could be feedback from surveys, or tardiness, or all sorts of different things. But each of those data points would be the intersection between how that particular aspect of job performance was and what the test score was. So down in the bottom left, you can see there's 2 points down there. So that's people who had very rare, relatively low job performance, and they also scored relatively low on the test. And then over at the top, you have one blue dot that's the highest scorer, who also does very well on the job. And that black line is a trend line that shows how do those work together. So in this case, it's what you would hope for from a test. The lower scorers have lower job performance, the higher scorers have higher job performance. So this kind of study would be taken with existing incumbent employees And that would be one way to do it. Or you could test it against job applicants and then wait a year and measure how well they were doing on the job and then go back and correlate it later. That's a hard thing to do because people don't like to do all that work and wait a year for the results. So it's usually done, called a concurrent study, that's done with incumbent employees, in which case you can get the results at that particular point in time. But what you end up knowing is that people who score higher on the job are going to have a greater degree of job performance. And so you can be very confident finding what your cutoff score is and then interviewing those that are north of the cutoff score, and you can feel very confident that those people are going to be good performers on the job, at least in terms of this particular aspect of job performance. Now, with the content validated skill and ability testing, you don't necessarily find that. Again, to go back to the person who types 35 words a minute versus the person who types 70 words a minute, that 70 scorer isn't not going to be twice the performer that the 35 per minute scorer is going to be. In many cases, what we're looking for is, do you reach or exceed a threshold? And that's really all that we want to know. And that's where your content validation approach comes into play. But in many instances, you can go on and do a criterion validation study that can be very helpful as well. Personality tests are always criterion validated. So basically, you're looking at what are the personal aspects of a human being that would contribute to high performers on the job, and what are the personal aspects of human beings that contribute to lower performers on the job. And so when you're testing for personality, you're going to look for those aspects of personality that match with the higher performers. And so criterion validation is the only way to go.
So our tests in TestGenius for HR, and then also for our dispatcher test, critical, we have the content validation tools, but they are also criterion validated.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you speak to that a little bit? Explain.
Yeah, it's always nice to be able to do a criterion validation study. And one of the beautiful things on the dispatch side is that dispatchers, call takers, telecommunicators, their jobs are very similar. There's a universality that exists between little tiny communities and large federal organizations. And we're able to do a criterion validation study with several different agencies who are contributing data to it, and then come up with a chart like this one right here for a variety of different tests. And then back to the uniform guidelines, once again, the uniform guidelines in section 7B talks about how you can transport criterion validity. And so what that means is that for criterion validation, they will allow you to transport a validation study from one organization to your organization, as long as you can establish that the job performance dimensions or domains that were measured in that original study are very similar to those that exist within your organization. And so it's a very simple survey. You get in the room with 12 people, you go through those job performance areas, and then they rate it on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 means it doesn't match my environment. 5 means it's exactly like my environment, and then all the numbers in between. And so if you get 12 people to agree that it's 52.5 or better, roughly 3, a rating of 3 or better, then you're going to be able to transport that validation study over to your own environment. And then you can just attach your transportability sheet to that validation study, and you can literally claim it as your own. It's a golden ticket kind of thing. And I'm really glad that you asked about this, because this hits on a point that we didn't talk about at all. One of the main reasons why we have a validation wizard for content validity is that you cannot transport content validity from one organization to another. You can't do it. Employers are responsible for establishing the validity of specific tests within specific job titles at their organization. And that's the difference. That's why we can't do a universal criterion validation study, because even if you go with administrative assistant, what does that mean? If you go to 100 different organizations, likely going to be 100 different jobs with 100 different requirements. And So you can't really do that for that particular role. But that's okay, because what we've done is we've given you the tools that allow you to do it in a matter of a couple hours. And now you have a validation report that says, for Acme County, for the position of dispatcher 1, here's our validation report. And it goes page after page, and it gives them really a blessing to go through and use that test. You go to another county and they want to go ahead and start testing, they might ask, hey, Acme, send me over the list of tests you're using. Acme might share those tests with them, but it doesn't mean that they're valid and consistent with business necessity, nor that the cutoff scores are job related and defensible. So that's why you go through the process, because go back to the coin, it's defensible on one side and has a high degree of utility on the other side.
Excellent. That was very helpful. Actually, I have the transportability sheet. Do we want to show that?
Sure. Absolutely. It's a pretty Excel spreadsheet. It's always fun to show an Excel file with colors in it. So yeah, basically we have this for the critical test, as well we have it for the critical personality test. And so on the left, you have the work behaviors, and those are too small for me to be able to see. But basically, it's going through the different dimensions that were measured in the original validation study. And at the top, you have SME1, SME2, SME is subject matter expert, through SME 12. And then on the far right is the rating scale, where 1 is that it doesn't match and 5 is that it does. And so basically, with the help of a leader, you go through and you just number the people, and you just say number 1, 5, number 2, 5, number 3, 4, number 4, 5, and you just put the numbers in there. And then when you get done, it does a calculation down at the bottom. And I don't know if you have that here, if this is just an image, but it will just validate that all 12 have filled it in and that the numbers are high enough. Yeah, there it is down there. So it's all red now down in that bottom where the orange box is. When you fill this out, it'll turn to green. And then if it's valid, then that little red box at the very bottom will turn to green. And that's it. You print that out, attach it to the validation report again, and you can now claim that validation report as your own. On the content validation side, you get your own validation report. So every validation that you do using the wizard is a custom validation for content validity for a specific position at a specific location for use by those people alone.
Oh, that's really cool. And we will, for our clients, if you're listening to this and would like to have a copy of that, just reach out to us, and we'll make sure that we send that to you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Mike, we've talked about content validity. We've talked about criterion validity. I've also heard you mention face validity.
Right. Face validity. I like to use a physics example here, which some people hate physics, but you have that something called centrifugal force. You're in the car and the car turns left, and you slam over into the right-hand side of the car. And that's called centrifugal force. And it's really what's known as a pseudo force. It's not a real force. It's just that the car turned from underneath you and your momentum kept going forward. And so that right-hand door ran into you, but it feels like a force. And face validity is similar to that. Face validity talks about how does the test feel to the applicant? Does it feel like a good experience? And that's another reason why work sample tests are very important. If you use work sample tests, you're presenting information to people, asking them to do things that are similar to things that would be done on the job. But we're doing it in a way where we don't require prior job knowledge. So we're asking them generic things, not things that they would need to know about this particular organization. Like, how do you use Excel in Acme County, for instance? That's something that would be trained, and we call it WT and LBO, would train or learned in a brief orientation. And so you don't want to test on those aspects, but we test things in a generic format that we can expect anybody with experience with that particular Excel, for instance, in this case, to be able to know. And then we translate that to how well they did, and then it's validated for the particular job. So that's how we do that for that part. And actually,
We talked about face validity. So if a test feels like a job and I fail the test, I get a feeling that I probably wouldn't have done a good job on that job, and I don't feel really bad about that. Our personality test for dispatchers was created with dispatch types of items. And so it feels very much like it's asking you questions that if you were a dispatcher. A lot of standardized personality tests have questions. Do you enjoy long, quiet strolls on a beach by yourself? Do you enjoy being in a loud movie theater? And so those things are not very face valid. They don't make you feel like you just asked me something that has any applicability to the job. And so face validity really is not important in terms of a test being valid, but it goes back to the optics thing that we talked about at the begin with, or to begin with. We now in the realm of social media, everybody's got a voice. And if I go and I test for a job at Acme Company and it's asking me about whether I prefer hot dogs or hamburgers, talk about that. When you take that test, it's going to be stupid. Now all of a sudden you're branded as the people with the stupid test. And so those are the reasons why you want to know about face validity. And that's another thing that you can really capture, not directly with our validation wizard, but you've got a group of people and it's asking them questions like, here's the knowledge, skill, or ability that's being measured. Does it feel similar enough to the way that the knowledge, skill, or ability is in use on this particular job? So you do end up getting that litmus test as to whether or not there was face validity or not. And that can be very helpful just in terms of your reputation.
Oh, for sure. I've taken our critical test and just the stress that I felt, and then just not having the opportunity to finish one job before the next call came in was really stressful. Yeah. So
it is. And it's really differentiating. It's the thing that says, I started taking that test in 1999 before it was released. And I'm not a multitasker either, and I hate it. So when I'm talking to people in the dispatch community, it's all about, hey, look, I could never do your job. And I've never done their job, but I've done the test and I hate the test and I don't score well on it. And so it's very effective in terms of it. In fact, what happens with the critical test is people like me who are not multitaskers will typically get up and walk away from the test rather than getting hired and getting up and walking away from the job after somebody spent $60,000 or $70,000 to train them. So it's a very useful attribute of the testing process to make people like you and me uncomfortable and let the real multitaskers get the job.
Well, and we have other tests too, right? We have a situational judgment test that actually also is face valid too. And I found the same experience there. And I think one of the tests had to do with technical support or customer service or something. So all that's to say that TestGenius, and I'm not trying to make a sales statement here, it's just something I'm really proud of about our software is that our tests are face valid. You can have the opportunity to make it content valid. And then also we have tests that have been Criterion validated as well.
Yes. Yeah. And those video situational tests that you referred to are phenomenal tests. They're really great. And they really hit on performance dimension attributes that the other tests don't hit on. And not only does it ask you how you would respond in certain situations, but it asks you, how will that person feel about your response, given your response? And so there's that. It's not an EQ test. It's not an EQ test per se. That is emotional quotient, which is a different aspect. But what it does is it requires that somebody has a degree of EQ to be able to empathize to the person that they would be talking to so that they can understand how that they were feeling. And in many jobs, it's a really important aspect, particularly if it's front facing or interacting with members of the public. It's just a really important thing. And that brings up, did we bring up the image with the test? The person, the testing,
we didn't know.
Yeah, let's show that for a second because that's an important aspect. We can close on that. So basically, when you're testing, that would be your job applicant over to the left there. And so as you add tests to your test battery or things that you're talking about in an interview, you're going to get little tiny slivers of job performance from each one. And so by having a multifaceted testing strategy, you actually continue on through this battery. And it might not all be TestGenius, it might be personality testing, it might be the Logiserve situational judgment testing, it might be the interview, it might be all sorts of other aspects, training and experience. But each one of these things is going to contribute to the picture of how job ready this person is. And as you continue on going through this recruitment process, you're going to learn more and more about them. And if you pause for just a second right here, what you want to really remember about this is that you want to get as many different pieces of the pie as possible, but it's equally important to make sure that you're measuring it in the right way. For instance, audio comprehension. You could call something audio comprehension, but if it's not valid and consistent with business necessity, it's not going to give you the results that you would expect. So that's just something
Yeah.
to consider. And you can go ahead and fill it out. You're never gonna know everything that you need to know about a person, but you get to a point where you've measured all that you can measure. And what it does is it helps to mitigate the risk. I know 80% of what I can know about this person from having spent time with them, talking to them, reading their job application, their experiences, testing them, looking at those results. So my risk is very low in terms of what I don't know about them. And so you can make a hiring decision with a greater
Mhm.
degree of confidence when you have a testing strategy that fits very well with the particular situation.
Yeah, I love this. And you've already mentioned this, but this looks like a dispatcher position, but it could easily
Right.
be administrative role where you might have Microsoft Excel on there or
Right. All
Word.
sorts of things, telephone
Hmm.
answering, there's spoken ability, English abilities, foreign language ability. We can measure all of these things, but it goes back to your test selection wizard. You're going to go through and you're going to choose the duties that are appropriate for that job, which are linked to tests that are appropriate for that job that you then go on and validate and then you administer. And you have a really good holistic recruitment strategy if you follow this process here.
Yeah, and that's really something to feel good about. You're creating a process that hires the candidate who's most likely to be successful on the job, your job, which leads to their fulfillment and you as an employer having a good fit. And it's fair and defensible. That's
Right.
something to be proud of.
Yeah, it's fair and defensible and going to end up with the right people. One of the things that I don't think people put enough emphasis on, it's not just about the person. It's not just about the person that you hire or the person that you don't hire. It's also about your existing employees. They're the people who are carrying the burden when you had the job openings. And so you want to
Hmm.
reward these
Hmm.
people by bringing somebody into the organization that is going to hit the ground running, that has the requisite skills and abilities necessary, that can be trained up quickly, and then is going to fit with that organization. And fit is something that maybe only a human being in an interview can determine. So you want to make sure whoever you're interviewing is somebody who has the requisite skills and abilities already. Because if you find that fit, and you fall in love with that person and they can't do the job, you have done a huge disservice to your existing employees. And they will get so depressed at having gone through that process, waited for somebody, got them all trained up only to find they can't do the job. And so the order is very important. In fact, if you go back to that first Acme slide that you have there, a lot of people will do this after a phone interview in that third brown box. Selected candidates take the pre-employment test. Our recommendation is ask people on the application everything that you can ask. Are you willing to work nights? Are you willing to work evenings, holidays?
Hmm.
Whatever is appropriate for that job, ask them on the application. Then take the people who are qualified applicants and then give them testing. Don't ever even talk to them. because you risk falling in love with a human being who is not able to do the job. And in fact, you're using human resources, and I'm saying that term generically, the resources of human beings, you're using them to talk to people who might not even take the pre-employment test. So why not save that valuable human time with only the most highly qualified applicant or candidate pool, so that the things that a software cannot discern, that a human being can discern, get sorted out in the interview. And that will result in a really great hire with really great benefits.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you brought it back to this, Mike. Thank you for that.
Many people do this. They'll come up to us at shows or on the phone and mention it. And we have to be careful, because it might be, maybe that's their civil service laws. They have to do it that way. So we're a little soft-handed in terms of telling people, what it is that they can do or should do. But the recommendation is definitely leave the humans out as long as possible, and only employ the human being's time when you know you're working with a really highly qualified list of candidates. Applicants apply, candidates are the people that you move forward. And that's a differentiation, but that's where your humans should jump in and start measuring the things that only humans can measure.
I think we're reaching an ending point today.
Okay.
And Mike, I always learn so much when I talk to you. I've worked with you and known you for a long time, and now you've added another layer on for me, so I appreciate it.
I appreciate all your questions. Your questions are great, and they really cause you to start thinking about the process and think about other aspects of it. So hopefully the discussions that we've had today will be ones that will result in positive step forwards for people who listen to the podcast. And that's great. Really
excellent. I hope so. Make sure, friends, to check out the show notes. We'll have links to the uniform guidelines in there and other information that we hope that you'll find useful. So thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks for tuning in to Testing 1 2 3, brought to you by TestGenius and Biddle Consulting Group. Visit our website at testgenius.com for more information.